Okay, so let's dive in. Yeah, let's really unpack the incredible world of Formula One. We're going to be drawing on all those great sources you shared with us for this deep dive. And this is really designed for you, the listener, to kind of give you that shortcut, that fast track to understanding the most exciting bits, the really important stuff about this amazing sport.
It really is amazing. It's such a blend, isn't it? You've got the speed, obviously, but then there's the cutting-edge science, the deep history, all the drama.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the spectacle. You can't forget that.
Definitely. So the material you've brought us, it covers F1's whole journey, how the cars work, the science bits, and even just what happens on a race weekend. It's from some really good sources, clearly aimed at helping newer fans get up to speed.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission today really is to explore all that together. We want to get right back to the roots of Grand Prix racing, see how these incredible machines have changed over, well, decades now.
And look at the engineering that makes them just so unbelievably fast.
Right. And break down what actually goes on over a Grand Prix weekend, to demystify it a bit, and touch on some of the big dynamics shaping the sport right now.
Yeah, the goal is pretty simple. By the time we're done here, you should feel, hopefully, a lot more plugged into F1. You'll have the context, the insights to really properly appreciate what you're seeing next time you tune in.
Think of us as your guides, yeah, taking you through the material.
Exactly, your pit crew for F1 knowledge.
Huh, I like that. Okay, perfect. So let's start right at the beginning. Where does this story of what we call Formula One actually kick off?
Well, it goes back further than a lot of people think. The sources trace F1's origins way back before World War II to something called Formula Libre regulation.
Formula Libre.
Yeah, it translates to free formula. It's widely seen as the oldest official set of rules in motorsport history, and that's actually where the name formula comes from, right there in those early attempts to define what kind of cars could race against each other.
Ah, okay. So formula isn't just some modern marketing thing. It actually comes from the very start, trying to create classes. But obviously, the war changed everything.
Oh, absolutely. World War II brought global motorsport, well, pretty much everything, to a grinding halt. But interestingly, after the war, especially in Europe, there was this huge pent-up desire to get back to racing, a real hunger for it.
And someone needed to bring some order to that, I guess.
That's where the FIA comes in, the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile. They're still the governing body today. To create a proper top level, a premier category for the fastest, most advanced cars, they officially laid down the Formula One regulations in 1946.
46, so just after the war.
Right. And the very first races held under these brand new F1 rules actually happened that same year, in 1946.
So F1 was defined then. Did they set up other levels of racing around the same time, like a ladder system?
They did, yeah. And it's a structure that, in principle still exists today with feeder series like F2 and F3. The FIA also codified rules for Formula 2 in 1948 that had smaller engines limited to 2 liters normally aspirated or 750cc if they were supercharged.
Supercharged. Wow, even back then.
Oh, yeah. And then a bit later came Formula 3 with even smaller 500cc engines. So you had this tiered system right from the early days.
Makes sense. But the sources point out something interesting. Even though F1 was the top tier, actually building cars for it was tough at first.
That's a really fascinating point, because the level of engineering needed for Formula One, even back then, was so advanced for the time. Teams really struggled. They found it hard to consistently build and get enough F1 cars onto the grid.
So what did they do? Just have really small races?
Well, the sources say that for a couple of seasons, right at the very beginning of the official World Championship, they actually ran the championship using Formula 2 rules instead, just to make sure they had enough cars on track to actually have a race.
No way. They used F2 rules for the F1 championship. That really shows how cutting-edge F1 was meant to be right from the word go.
Absolutely. It highlights the difficulty, and you can see the echoes of that today, can't you? The idea that F1 is the absolute pinnacle, and you need these feeder series like F2 and F3 to develop the talent, both drivers and engineers, to make the step up.
That structure was there from the start.
Pretty much. But the sources do note that things started to settle down by the mid-1950s. The championship became more stable, teams got a better handle on the F1 regulations, and they could consistently field proper F1 cars.
Okay, so the racing got more consistent. What was the big prize they were all fighting for back in the 50s?
In those early days, the 1950s, it was all about the driver. There was only one official championship, the World Drivers' Championship. That went to the driver who scored the most points across all the races in the season. The idea of a separate championship for the teams, the constructors, that came later on.
Right, okay. So Rules in place, championship finding its feet. Let's get into those foundational years, the 1950s. Sounds like it was pretty wild.
Oh, definitely. The sources paint a really vivid picture. That very first official F1 World Championship race. It happened at Silverstone in the UK, May 13th, 1950.
Silverstone.
Yeah.
Still on the calendar today.
Exactly. But back then, you got to remember, Silverstone was basically just a repurposed World War II airfield. Runways and perimeter roads. Not exactly the tailored circuit we know now. It tells you a lot about the raw nature of early F1.
Just imagine racing around an old airfield. Who was on the grid for that first historic race? Any names we'd recognize?
Oh, legendary names. Even then, Alfa Romeo was dominant at the start. Then Ferrari, Maserati, these were the big players. And the crowd, apparently massive. The sources mention 150,000 spectators turned up.
150,000 for the first race. That's incredible.
It really set the tone, didn't it? Showed the potential appeal right away.
So who took the flag? Who won that very first F1 World Championship race?
That honor went to Giuseppe Farina, driving an Alfa Romeo. He etched his name in the history books right there. The sources describe his driving style as intelligent, but also maybe a bit petulant is the word used. He pushed the boundaries with rivals, could be quite aggressive on track.
Huh. Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Some things never change. And Farina, he wasn't exactly a young gun, was he?
Not at all. He was 43 years old when he won that first race, which really highlights how much experience counted in those incredibly dangerous early days. His age and racecraft were key advantages against younger guys like Fangio and Ascari who were just starting out in F1.
Experience over youthful exuberance back then. Makes sense given the risks. And that first season, they raced at some pretty legendary circuits.
Yeah, the calendar was amazing. Tracks that are still revered today. Monaco, Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium, Reims in France, Bremgarten in Switzerland, the mighty Monza in Italy, and Pedralbes in Spain.
Wow. Monaco's tight streets versus the flat-out speed of Monza. That's a massive difference in what the drivers needed to do.
Exactly. It shows the variety of challenges right from the start. The sources point out these tracks demanded totally different skills. You need precision and bravery for Monaco's walls, pure courage and mechanical sympathy for the high-speed blasts at Monza or Spa. To be good, you had to master it all.
So who were the real stars, the legends forged in that fiery first decade?
Several big names emerge, but one really dominates the story of the 50s. That's Juan Manuel Fangio, the Argentine racing maestro. He made his debut in 1950 and just, well, set the standard. His style was incredibly smooth, calculated. He just seemed to understand the race better than anyone else.
And his record. It's just insane, isn't it?
It's mind-blowing. 5 world championships in the 1950s. And the truly astonishing part, the thing that really shows his genius and adaptability, is that he won those titles with 4 different manufacturers.
4 different teams. Who were they?
Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, Mercedes-Benz, and Maserati. He's still the only driver in history to win the title with that many different constructors. It just proves his skill wasn't tied to one specific car. He could get in anything and be quick.
That's incredible adaptability.
And the stats are just staggering. A win rate of 46.15%. He won nearly half the championship races he started and took pole position in over 55% of them. Just utter dominance.
Who could possibly challenge someone like that?
His main rival, especially in the early part of the decade, was Alberto Ascari, the Italian hero driving for Scuderia Ferrari. Ascari won back-to-back titles in 1952 and 53 when F1 briefly ran to F2 regulations, actually. He was a huge star in Italy. There's still a chicane at Monza named after him, the Variante Ascari.
A fitting tribute. And we can't talk about the 50s without mentioning the British hero, Stirling Moss.
Absolutely not. Stirling Moss, often called the uncrowned champion, a British racing prodigy, a fearless challenger, as the sources put it. He really burst onto the scene around 1955 and was hugely popular with the fans.
He famously won the British Grand Prix, didn't he? First Brit to do it.
That's right, at Aintree in 1955. A huge moment. But the sources make a key point. Moss's prime coincided almost perfectly with Fangio's era of dominance. So despite his incredible talent and winning lots of races, he finished runner-up in the championship 4 times in a row and never quite clinched the world title himself.
Still a legend, though, even without the title.
Oh, completely. His skill, his daring overtakes, his sportsmanship. He was a massive fan favorite, especially in Britain, a true icon of the sport.
It's easy to get caught up in the romance of it all, the speed, the heroes. But the sources constantly remind us about the other side, the sheer, terrifying danger.
Yeah, it's impossible to overstate this. The sources really hammer this home. Getting into an F1 car in the 1950s, it was taking your life in your hands. every single time. One source uses this really striking image. It was like walking up to the Grim Reaper and daring him to catch you. Safety was. Well, it wasn't really a concept yet.
What basic safety things that we just take for granted now were missing back then?
Pretty much everything. Seatbelts, not mandatory. Fireproof overalls, nope. A strong survival cell around the driver, didn't exist. The halo we see today, decades away. Drivers were incredibly exposed. Survival often came down to sheer luck, their own skill, and whether the car decided not to brake.
And tragically, that risk had real consequences. Fatalities happened, including one of the era's biggest stars.
Yes, a really pivotal and sad moment was the death of Alberto Ascari in 1955. And it wasn't even in an F1 race. Just 4 days after he'd had this spectacular crash at the Monaco Grand Prix where his Lancia plunged into the harbor.
He survived that.
Miraculously, yes, he swam away. But then just days later, he was testing a Ferrari sports car at Monza, crashed, and was killed.
Just days after cheating death, that must have sent shockwaves through the sport.
Huge shockwaves. The sources really point to Ascari's death, coming so soon after his Monaco escape, as a brutal reminder of the constant lurking danger. That, plus another horrific accident at the Le Mans 24 Hours race that same year, involving a Mercedes which tragically killed the driver, and over 80 spectators really forced a pause. Several Grand Prix were canceled in '55, and it triggered the very first, albeit slow, conversations about improving safety in motorsport.
It always seems like tragedy is the catalyst for a change in safety. Okay, so moving towards the end of the 50s, the sport itself changed structurally in a really important way.
Yes, 1958 was a key year. That's when they introduced an official championship, or International Cup as it was initially called, specifically for the Formula One manufacturers, the teams.
The beginnings of the Constructors Championship we know today.
Exactly. It was separate from the Drivers' Championship. The point system back then, the sources explain, was 8 points for first, then 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 for the top 6 finishers. But here's the crucial bit. Only the highest-placed car from each manufacturer could score points in any given race.
So it wasn't just about having two fast drivers. It rewarded the team whose best car performed consistently well. Interesting. Who won that first ever manufacturer's title?
That went to a British team, Van Wall, and Stirling Moss was instrumental in their success that year. The sources highlight this win as really the start of decades of strong performance and innovation from British constructors in F1.
And speaking of Moss in 1958, there's an incredible story about sportsmanship, isn't there? The one involving the driver's title.
Oh, it's one of F1's greatest anecdotes. Really says something about the era. At the Portuguese Grand Prix that year, Moss's main rival for the title, Mike Hawthorne, spun his Ferrari. To restart, he drove briefly against the direction of the track on the pavement. The officials were going to disqualify him.
Which would have cost him the championship, presumably.
Potentially, yes. But Stirling Moss had seen the whole incident. He went directly to the race stewards and argued on Hawthorne's behalf, explaining what happened and insisting he hadn't gained any advantage. Moss's testimony convinced the stewards not to disqualify Hawthorne.
And Hawthorne went on to win the title.
By a single point. Over Moss himself. Hawthorne became Britain's first F1 world champion. And the sources are clear. Moss's act of sportsmanship in Portugal, arguing for his rival, directly enabled Hawthorne to win that title. Just amazing integrity.
Truly remarkable. 1958 seems like a year of firsts. The sources mention another milestone from that year, too.
Yes, a very significant one. It was the year Maria Teresa de Filippis raced a private Maserati at the Belgian Grand Prix, becoming the first woman ever to compete in a Formula One World Championship race.
That's fantastic. And right at the end of the 50s, there was a hint of a massive technical shift coming. Something about where the engine was placed.
That's right. Up until then, almost all successful Grand Prix cars had the engine at the front, driving the rear wheels. But Stirling Moss, again driving a Cooper Climax, won the 1958 Argentine Grand Prix. And that Cooper had its engine mounted behind the driver.
The first rear-engine win in F1.
In the World Championship era, yes. The sources call this the first real sign, the hint of the mid-engine revolution that would completely transform F1 car design in the next decade. It was also, interestingly, the first F1 win for a car where the chassis and engine came from different manufacturers. Cooper chassis, Climax engine. That supplier model became huge later on.
Engine behind the driver. Yeah, I know Enzo Ferrari famously wasn't keen on that idea at first.
He definitely wasn't. The sources mention his famous quote about, "The horse pulls the cart, it doesn't push it." He was deeply skeptical about putting the engine behind the driver. But as the 1960s dawned, the performance benefits were about to become undeniable, even for Enzo.
So the 1960s really cemented this mid-engine revolution then.
It absolutely did. While Ferrari did stick with front engines for a bit longer, the late 50s and especially the early 60s saw this fundamental shift across the grid. Rear or mid-engine cars became the norm. The sources describe the 60s as just this hugely transformative period, not just technically, but especially for British teams.
Yeah, the swinging 60s seemed to be when British teams really took over F1.
Completely. The sources really highlight the rise of these iconic British constructors. Teams like Lotus and BRM weren't just winning, they were pushing the boundaries of design and engineering.
Lotus, under Colin Chapman. They were known for being pretty radical, weren't they?
Oh, Colin Chapman was a genuine visionary. His guiding philosophy became legendary. Simplify, then add lightness. He obsessed over reducing weight, believing that lightness was the key to performance, not just brute power. This led to some incredibly innovative, sometimes fragile, but often brilliantly fast cars.
And the driver most associated with Lotus in that era is Jim Clark.
Jim Clark, an absolute legend, often considered one of the greatest natural talents ever. He really embodied that Lotus philosophy and British racing dominance. His world championships in 1963 and 1965, driving the Lotus Climax, were just masterclasses.
How did those Lotus cars compare to, say, Ferrari at the time?
It was a real contrast in philosophies, according to the sources. Ferrari still focused on powerful but heavier engines. Lotus, with Chapman's focus on lightness and handling, created cars that were incredibly nimble. On twisty tracks, the Lotus's superior handling and the fact that it was easier on its tires more than made up for any straight-line speed deficit they might have had to the more powerful Ferraris.
So handling became king in the 60s. And BRM, they were another big British name.
Yes, British Racing Motors BRM. They were a major force too. They developed their own powerful V8 engine and built competitive chassis. Drivers like Graham Hill, who earned the nickname Mr. Monaco for his incredible record there, brought BRM championship glory in 1962.
And then there's Jack Brabham, who did something completely unique in the 60s.
An amazing achievement. Jack Brabham, the Australian driver, not only started his own racing team, Brabham,
which is incredible in itself.
Right. But then, in 1966, he won the Formula One World Championship driving one of his own cars. He remains the first, and so far the only, person ever to do that. And the Brabham team became hugely successful. The sources note they were the largest manufacturer of customer racing cars in the world during the 60s. Just an incredible story of driving skill and entrepreneurial success.
So the 60s, mid-engines, British dominance, incredible innovation. But with all that speed increase, the sources are very clear the danger didn't go away, it got worse.
Yeah, that's the constant, tragic counterpoint to the progress. The sources really emphasize that as the cars got faster and lighter, the risks escalated dramatically. There were several high-profile, terrible accidents during the decade that served as grim reminders.
The Wolfgang von Tripp's accident in Monza in '61 is mentioned as being particularly awful.
It was horrific. Von Trips was fighting for the championship with his Ferrari teammate Phil Hill. At Monza, his Ferrari touched wheels with Jim Clark's Lotus, went airborne, and crashed into a spectator bank. Von Trips was killed instantly, along with 15 spectators. The sources underline how this catastrophe highlighted the desperate need for better safety measures, not just for drivers, but for the crowds, too.
Getcha.
Fencing, things like that.
And the drivers themselves started pushing back, demanding better safety.
They did. They started to find their voice. The sources detail a really significant moment, the boycott of the 1969 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. The drivers, led by Jackie Stewart, collectively refused to race because the organizers hadn't made safety improvements to the incredibly fast and dangerous Spa circuit that the drivers had requested.
Wow, a driver boycott. How did people react to that back then?
Surprisingly negatively in some quarters. The sources mention a famous motorsport journalist, Dennis Jenkinson, who basically criticized the drivers, saying they lacked guts for refusing to race. Which, looking back now, knowing the risks they took, it seems completely unbelievable.
Especially when you read about accidents like Jackie Stewart's own terrifying crash at Spa a few years earlier.
Exactly. The sources recount Stewart's horrifying experience in 1966. First lap, torrential rain, cars going off everywhere. Stewart's BRM crashed heavily, ending up upside down in a farmhouse cellar, actually, with fuel pouring over him.
Trapped, upside down, in fuel.
For 25 minutes, he was eventually rescued by fellow drivers Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant, who'd also crashed nearby, using tools borrowed from a spectator's car because the marshals didn't have any. And the most shocking part, even though about half the grid crashed out on that first lap, the race just carried on under green flags. Safety just wasn't the priority. Stewart became a lifelong campaigner for safety after that.
25 minutes. It's just unthinkable today. Okay, so safety is becoming a major urgent issue bubbling under the surface. But the late 60s also saw another huge change. Big money started pouring into the sport.
This was fundamental. The sources describe money as the essential fuel for the technological arms race in F1. And the late 1960s saw this financial revolution kick off with the arrival of major sponsors, especially from the tobacco and oil industries.
And who was the very first team to run a car in a sponsor's colors?
The sources pinpoint a private South African team called Team Gunston. They entered a Brabham painted in the red and gold colors of Gunston cigarettes for their home Grand Prix in South Africa at the start of 1968.
A private team first, not a factory team.
That's right. But the factory teams cottoned on immediately. At the very next race, the 1968 Spanish Grand Prix, Colin Chapman's factory Lotus team appeared in the famous red, gold, and white colors of Gold Leaf cigarettes. The sources stress this moment really marked the beginning of a new era. Big sponsorship money was now central to funding F1 teams and driving development.
Right. So the 60s end with this potent mix. Mid-engines established, British teams on top, safety becoming a huge concern, and commercial sponsorship arriving in a big way. This really sets the scene for the 1970s, which the sources call a golden age.
Yeah, the 70s are often described that way, a really dynamic, transformative decade. The sources paint it as a time of incredibly fierce competition, iconic cars, and a whole galaxy of charismatic star drivers.
Who are some of the standout names from the 70s grid?
Oh, huge personalities. You had Emerson Fittipaldi, Jackie Stewart winning his final title early on, James Hunt, Niki Lauda.
Like
Their rivalry became legendary, even a movie. Then Mario Andretti, Jody Scheckter.
Scheckter won a title, right? A first for his continent.
He did. Jody Scheckter, driving for Ferrari in 1979, became the first and still the only Formula One world champion from the continent of Africa, a major milestone.
And with all that sponsorship money flowing in now, the sources mentioned the drivers' lifestyles changed a bit.
Yeah, they definitely did. Driver salaries started to climb significantly thanks to the sponsor deals. And the sources point out, because the sport was still incredibly dangerous, drivers were still being killed, there was this attitude of living life to the full. The Playboy driver image, living like rock stars, really took hold in the 70s for some.
Makes sense, in a grim way. Live fast, die young. But alongside the glamour and danger, the 70s saw a major technical innovation come back in a big way: ground effect.
This was huge. It fundamentally changed how F1 cars generated grip and how they looked. The sources again credit Colin Chapman and Lotus with really pioneering the effective use of ground effect aerodynamics in F1, particularly with their Lotus 78 car, nicknamed the wing car.
So how did ground effect work on those 70s cars?
The basic idea, the sources explain, is to shape the underside of the car like an inverted airplane wing. They created these curved tunnels called Venturi tunnels running underneath the side pods. As air flows through these tunnels, it speeds up, creating a low-pressure area beneath the car. This low pressure literally sucks the car down onto the track.
Creating downforce without relying just on big wings on top.
Exactly. Massive amounts of downforce. And teams quickly figured out how to make it even more powerful. They added sliding skirts along the bottom edges of the side pods. These skirts, made of plastic or composite materials, physically scraped along the ground, sealing the airflow under the car.
Sealing it off. Why was that important?
It stopped air from leaking in from the sides, making the Venturi tunnels incredibly efficient. The low pressure became much more intense. This technology developed rapidly, and Mario Andretti won the 1978 World Championship in the Lotus 79, the first car really designed from the ground up to maximize ground effect with these skirts.
The cornering speeds must have been unbelievable. But the sources warned this came with some serious safety issues.
Oh, big time. While incredibly fast through corners, ground effect cars were notoriously tricky and dangerous. The sources highlight a couple of major problems. Firstly, the sheer cornering forces were immense. But the bigger issue was the reliance on those skirts maintaining a perfect seal.
What happened if the seal broke?
If a spurt got damaged, or if the car hit a bump or a curb and lifted even slightly, the seal would break instantly. Air would rush under the car, destroying the low-pressure zone. This meant a sudden, catastrophic loss of downforce.
Then at high speed in a corner.
The car would just snap away, become instantly unstable. It led to some very sudden, very big accidents. Drivers found them incredibly difficult to handle on the limit because the grip could just disappear without warning.
So predictably, the FIA had to step in eventually.
Yes, the safety concerns became too great. The sources state that regulations were brought in to first ban the sliding skirts in 1981, though it was briefly reversed. And then, more significantly, they mandated flat bottoms for the cars from 1983 onwards. Flat floors still generated some ground effect, but it wasn't as extreme or as sensitive as the skirted Venturi tunnels. Again, it was about trying to rein in those cornering speeds for safety.
It's a recurring theme.
Yeah.
Speaking of extreme designs in that era, the sources mention a truly bizarre car from Brabham in 1978, the fan car.
Ah, yes, the legendary Brabham BT46B, designed by the brilliant Gordon Murray. The sources recount this fascinating story. The car didn't have conventional water radiators. Instead, it used surface heat exchangers. And most strikingly, it had a massive fan mounted at the back.
A fan, what was that for?
Well, officially, Brabham claimed it was purely for cooling the engine. But everyone knew it also sucked huge amounts of air out from underneath the car, creating massive ground effect downforce. It raced just once at the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix, and Niki Lauda dominated, winning easily.
And the other teams weren't happy.
Not at all. They protested furiously. Brabham, led by Bernie Ecclestone at the time, actually withdrew the car voluntarily after that one race to avoid a big political fight, even though it was arguably legal under the rules as written. It remains this iconic example of loophole exploitation and extreme aerodynamic thinking in F1.
A fan car. Just amazing ingenuity. Okay, so ground effect dominated the late 70s, but another huge technical wave was building the turbo era.
That's right. Turbocharging wasn't entirely new to motorsport, but the late 70s is when it really arrived in Formula One, spearheaded by Renault, and it would come to define the next decade.
So remind us, how does a turbo actually make an engine more powerful?
The sources give a good, basic explanation. A turbocharger uses the engine's own exhaust gas as waste energy, essentially to spin a turbine wheel at incredibly high speeds. This turbine is connected by a shaft to another wheel, a compressor, which sucks in fresh air and forces it into the engine cylinders under pressure.
More air means you can burn more fuel.
Exactly. More air and fuel in the cylinder equals a bigger bang, which equals more power, significantly more power, without needing a physically larger engine. The sources mentioned the rule of thumb back then was that a 1.5-liter turbocharged engine could produce roughly the same power as a 3.0-liter naturally aspirated engine, which was the alternative engine formula allowed at the time.
So double the displacement equivalent. That's a huge advantage if you can get it right. Who got the first turbo win?
That milestone belongs to Jean-Pierre Jabouille and Renault. He won the 1979 French Grand Prix at Dijon-Prenois in the Renault RS01. Renault were the true pioneers of F1 turbos. The sources note their early turbo cars were notoriously unreliable. They often blew up spectacularly, earning the nickname Yellow Teapot, but that win in '79 was hugely significant. It proved the turbo concept could win races.
Did the other big teams jump on the turbo bandwagon straight away?
It took a little while. Developing reliable, powerful turbo engines was complex and expensive, but seeing Renault's potential, the others knew they had to respond. The sources mention that Ferrari, BMW, Honda, Alfa Romeo, and eventually Tag Porsche, funding the Porsche engine from McLaren, all started developing their own turbo engines throughout the early 80s. But they all faced their own challenges, their own teething problems getting the technology right.
Which brings us squarely into the 1980s, the absolute peak of the turbo madness.
Oh, this was the era of just insane power. Raw, brutal, almost uncontrollable power. The 1980s saw F1 turbo engines reach power levels that are still mind-boggling today. The sources state that race engines were regularly producing over 1,000 brake horsepower.
1,000 horsepower from a tiny 1.5-liter engine.
In race trim. And for qualifying, where they'd turn the boost pressure way up for just 1 or 2 laps, the estimates went much higher. The sources talk about figures possibly reaching 1,300, maybe even 1,400 horsepower. Dynos at the time couldn't even accurately measure the peak output.
1,400 horsepower. How did the drivers even handle that?
With great difficulty. The sources mention specific examples like Nelson Piquet's BMW engine in his Brabham in '83, which was widely regarded as one of the most powerful, well over 1,250 bhp in qualifying spec, and Gerhard Berger hitting an incredible 317.5 kilometers per hour, that's nearly 209 kilometers per hour down a straight in Monza, in qualifying in his Benetton BMW in 1986. Just staggering speeds.
Were there still downsides, problems they had to solve?
Oh yeah. Turbo lag was still a big issue. That's the delay between the driver hitting the throttle and the turbo spinning up to deliver the power. It made the cars really tricky to drive smoothly out of corners, and reliability, while improving, was always a concern when you're pushing engines that hard. Lots of spectacular blow-ups still happened.
Which teams really mastered this turbo technology in the 80s?
The sources really point to two teams dominating the mid to late 80s, McLaren and Williams. McLaren, under Ron Dennis's meticulous leadership, formed a hugely successful partnership with Porsche, who built the Tag-branded turbo engines. That McLaren-Tag-Porsche combination won championships from 1984 to 1986. Williams, using Honda engines later in the decade, also became incredibly dominant.
And this era of huge power and dominant teams also produced some absolutely epic driver rivalries.
Some of the greatest ever. The sources mention the intense partnership and rivalry between Alain Prost and the returning Niki Lauda at McLaren. Lauda famously beat Prost to the 1984 title by just half a point, the smallest margin ever.
Half a point. Incredible. But the rivalry that really defined the late 80s and beyond started then too, didn't it?
The big one, Ayrton Senna versus Alain Prost. It ignited when Senna joined Prost at McLaren in 1988. The sources briefly touch on their hugely controversial collision at the Japanese Grand Prix in 1989, which decided the title in Prost's favor that year, as just one flashpoint in this incredibly intense, often bitter psychological battle that gripped the entire sport.
Senna versus Prost. Legendary stuff. So the turbo era gave us insane speed, huge drama. Why did it end? Surely they wouldn't give up all that power.
Ultimately, it came down to safety again. And cost, to some extent. The speeds were becoming just astronomical, and the FIA felt things were getting out of control. The sources state clearly that the governing body decided to mandate a return to naturally aspirated engines only, specifically 3.5-liter V10s or V12s mainly, starting from the 1989 season. This was a direct move to curb the extreme performance. In the final years of the turbo era, they had already started restricting things like fuel limits and boost pressure, using pop-off valves to try and cap the power.
So another major technical reset, driven by safety concerns about too much speed, which leads us nicely into the 1990s. The sources describe this next era as one of increasing complexity, plenty of controversy, but still relentless speed.
Yeah, the 90s is when F1 really started to feel much more like the high-tech sport we recognize today. One key shift, the sources note, was reliability. With all the money now in the sport from sponsors and manufacturers returning, components just got much, much better.
So cars breaking down became less common than in the 70s or 80s.
Much less common. Reliability kind of became expected. It wasn't the huge variable it once was. So the sources explain, the engineering focus shifted. It wasn't just about making a car that could finish anymore. It was about squeezing every last thousandth of a second out, building the fastest possible car because you could be reasonably confident it would actually make it to the end of the race. This just intensified the push for pure performance.
And the 90s saw the emergence of a driver who would arguably become the most famous name in F1 history, Michael Schumacher.
Absolutely. The sources introduced Michael Schumacher as this new dominant force arriving on the scene. He would go on to define not just the 90s, but the early 2000s, eventually smashing records with 7 world championships and 91 race wins. An icon.
But his early championship years with Benetton, they weren't without controversy, were they?
No, definitely not. The sources are quite clear about the controversies surrounding Schumacher and Benetton, especially during his first title year in 1994. There were lingering questions about the legality of the Benetton car that year, with rivals suspecting they might have been using banned electronic aids like traction control.
And incidents on track, too.
Yes, there was the notorious fuel rig fire during a pit stop at the German Grand Prix involving Schumacher's teammate Jos Verstappen, which raised safety questions. And Schumacher himself faced penalties. The sources mention he was disqualified from the British Grand Prix for overtaking Damon Hill on the formation lap, and then got a 2-race ban for ignoring the black flag shown to him during that race. He also had a win in Belgium taken away due to excessive wear on the car's under-tray plank.
It all sounds quite chaotic, and it culminated in that hugely controversial end to the 1994 season.
The sources detail that infamous final race in Adelaide, Australia. Schumacher was leading the championship, just 1 point ahead of Damon Hill in the Williams. Schumacher made a mistake, ran wide, hit the wall, and damaged his car. As Hill came alongside to pass him for the lead and likely the championship, Schumacher turned in sharply, colliding with Hill.
Taking them both out.
Both out of the race, which meant Schumacher won the world championship by that single point. The sources describe it as a moment of peak aggression, ruthless determination, maybe even desperation, that cemented his reputation as someone who would do absolutely anything to win. Highly controversial.
So definitely a complex figure, but the sources also make sure to highlight his incredible driving talent, separate from the controversy.
Oh, absolutely. His skill was undeniable. The sources point to just astonishing displays of car control, particularly his virtuoso drives in wet conditions. Races like Spa and the Nürburgring in 1995, where he just dominated in treacherous weather, left no doubt about his extraordinary ability. Even his critics had to acknowledge they were watching a truly great driver emerge.
After winning 2 titles with Benetton, he made that huge, career-defining switch to Ferrari.
This was the start of something massive. The sources call it the Ferrari project. Schumacher joined the legendary Italian team in 1996. Ferrari was, believe it or not, in a bit of a slump. They hadn't won a driver's title since Jody Scheckter way back in 1979, or a constructor's title since 1983. Schumacher's mission was clear: rebuild the team, bring the glory days back to Maranello.
A massive task, and the sources say it took time.
It did. They note it would take 5 long, often frustrating years before that project delivered the Drivers' World Championship. But Schumacher wasn't just a driver, he was a team builder. He brought key people with him from Benetton.
Right, the famous Dream Team started forming then.
Exactly. Recruited by the then-new team principal Jean Todt, Schumacher was joined by Ross Brawn as technical director and Rory Byrne as chief designer. Along with Ferrari's engine guru, Paolo Martinelli, this core group formed the technical leadership that would eventually achieve unprecedented success.
And even in that first year, 1996, when the Ferrari car wasn't really competitive, there were signs of what was to come.
Definite flashes of brilliance. The sources specifically highlight Schumacher's incredible win at the 1996 Spanish Grand Prix in Barcelona. It rained torrentially, basically flooded the track. Rain is often called the great leveler in F1 because it reduces the car's advantage and emphasizes driver skill. Schumacher just drove away from everyone, lapping almost the entire field in a car that was clearly inferior in the dry. It was a stunning statement of his talent and the partnership's potential. He managed 2 more wins that year, too, in Belgium and Italy.
While Ferrari was building, who was setting the pace in the mid-90s?
That was predominantly Williams. The sources credit their dominance to really smart technical innovation. They particularly single out the 1992 Williams Renault, the FW14B, as just this incredibly advanced, dominant machine.
What made the FW14B so special? It's often talked about as one of the greats.
It was packed with technology that was leagues ahead of its rivals. The sources mention its sophisticated, computer-controlled, active suspension. This system constantly adjusted the car's ride height and stiffness at each corner, keeping the aerodynamic platform perfect and maximizing grip. It also had highly effective traction control to prevent wheel spin under acceleration and anti-lock brakes initially.
So basically electronic driver aids that were later banned.
Many of them were, yes. But in 1992, Williams perfected them. The result: Nigel Mansell had an utterly dominant season in that car. The sources note he won 9 of the first 11 races and clinched the World Championship incredibly early, back in August.
Active suspension and traction control. A massive advantage. The 90s also brought some significant rule changes affecting the basics, like fuel and tires.
Yes, the FIA continued to tweak the technical regulations. The sources detailed changes to fuel rules starting around 92-93. They moved away from exotic, potentially harmful fuel blends towards specifications much closer to regular pump gasoline, complying with European health and safety standards. It was an early push to make F1 tech slightly more relevant to road cars.
And then came a very visible change in 1998, narrower cars and those infamous groove tires.
Yes, the groove tires. This was a huge change, and again, driven purely by safety concerns. The sources explain the FIA wanted to reduce cornering speeds, which they felt had become dangerously high again. So for 1998, they mandated narrower cars down from 2 meters wide to 1.8 meters. And crucially, they replaced the slip tires, which offer maximum grip, with tires that had grooves cut into them.
Grooves on a racing tire. That seems totally backward for performance.
It was meant to be. The sources state the whole point was to reduce the tire's contact patch with the track surface. Less rubber on the road means less grip, which means lower cornering speeds. In 98, they had 4 longitudinal grooves on the rear tires and 3 on the front. That changed to 4 grooves front and rear from 1999. It was a very direct, if controversial, way to try and slow the cars down in the corners.
Another attempt to control speed. What other tech areas were advancing rapidly in the 90s?
Electronics continued to explode. The sources mention increasingly sophisticated car electronics, telemetry systems sending vast amounts of data back to the pits, and teams relying heavily on data analysis for setup and strategy. Aerodynamics also got more and more complex. We saw the rise of high noses, intricate barge boards behind the front wheels to manage airflow, and lots of little winglets appearing all over the cars. Wind tunnels became essential, and teams started seriously investing in computational fluid dynamics, CFD, the computer simulation of airflow.
And inside the cockpit, a major change in how drivers change gear.
Yes, the widespread adoption of semi-automatic gearboxes. Ferrari pioneered this, introducing paddles mounted on the back of the steering wheel to shift gears electronically without needing a clutch pedal after the start. This allowed for much faster gear changes, improved performance, and reduced the driver's workload. It quickly became standard across the grid.
We've mentioned safety improvements being reactive, but 1994, that year, stands as a terribly dark moment, even against the backdrop of improving safety trends overall.
It was a devastating weekend. While the 1980s had been the first decade in F1 history without double-digit driver fatalities, the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix at Imola served as this brutal, tragic reminder that the danger was ever present. Over that one weekend, rookie driver Roland Ratzenberger was killed during qualifying on Saturday. And then horrifically, during the race on Sunday, the legendary three-time world champion Ayrton Senna died after crashing his Williams at high speed. The sources also mention Rubens Barrichello had a huge accident on Friday, luckily surviving.
2 deaths, 1 serious injury, all in one weekend. Senna's death in particular shook the world, didn't it?
It absolutely did. Senna was a global superstar. The sources are clear. Imola 94 was undeniable proof that the cars, despite previous safety efforts, had once again become too fast for the circuits and the safety standards of the time. The FIA had to act, and act immediately.
What changes did they make right away?
Significant ones. Starting from the very next race, just weeks later at the Spanish Grand Prix, the sources detail mandated changes. They shortened the rear diffusers, changed the front wing end plates to reduce downforce, forced teams to cut holes in the engine airboxes to reduce power. And then, crucially, from the German Grand Prix onwards, they introduced the mandatory wooden plank fitted to the underside of the car.
The plank, what did that do?
It set a minimum ride height. If the plank wore down too much during the race due to the car running too low and scraping the ground, the driver would be disqualified. This forced teams to raise the ride height, which reduced the effectiveness of the underbody aerodynamics and thus, crucially, reduced cornering speeds.
There it is again, limiting cornering speed.
Exactly. The sources stress that controlling cornering speed became the absolute #1 priority for the FIA after the tragedies of Imola in 1994. It's a principle that has guided technical regulations ever since. The lessons from that dark weekend fundamentally reshaped F1's approach to safety.
Despite all that drama and the technical shifts, the end of the 90s finished on a rather strange, unpredictable note, didn't it? The 1999 season.
Yeah, 1999 was a weird one. The sources describe it as a year where it almost felt like nobody seemed to want to win the championship. Frontrunners kept stumbling. They detail how Ferrari's main title contender, Michael Schumacher, broke his leg in a crash at Silverstone mid-season, putting him out for several races.
So his teammate, Eddie Irvine, stepped up to challenge for the title.
He did, surprisingly well for Ferrari. Meanwhile, the reigning champion, Mika Häkkinen in the McLaren, who was incredibly fast, just kept having bizarre setbacks. The sources list them: a wheel literally falling off his car while leading in Italy, getting accidentally spun by his own teammate, a massive crash after a tire failure, costly driver errors. It was dramatic.
So who eventually took the title?
Häkkinen managed to pull it together right at the end. Schumacher returned for the final races and tried to help Irvine win the championship for Ferrari, but Häkkinen held on to clinch his second consecutive world title at the final race in Japan. Ferrari did win the Constructors Championship that year, which was important for them financially, but they'd failed to win the driver's title for the second decade running.
That unpredictable 99 season really paved the way for a completely new chapter, didn't it?
It set the stage for an era of unprecedented dominance by one team and one driver, the start of what the sources call the modern dynasty era.
And that first and arguably most defining dynasty was Ferrari and Michael Schumacher, starting right in 2000.
Oh, yeah. The sources describe the period from 2000 to 2004 as just unrelenting dominance. It was Ferrari, led by Jean Todt, with Schumacher behind the wheel, Ross Brawn on strategy, Rory Byrne designing the cars, Paolo Martinelli on engines. It all just clicked perfectly. The sources call it a symphony of engineering, strategy, and driving skill.
So that dream team we talked about, finally delivered on its promise.
Massively. They'd won the constructors' title in '99, which is where a lot of the prize money is. But that driver's title drought stretched all the way back to 1979. The pressure was immense.
When did the breakthrough finally come for the Drivers' Championship?
2000 was the year. The sources pinpoint it as the turning point. Schumacher won the first race of the season and actually started with a hat trick of victories. There were ups and downs, battles with McLaren's Häkkinen, but the combination of Braun's strategic brilliance and Schumacher's relentless driving, they highlight a key strategic win at Imola, finally brought the Drivers' World Championship back to Ferrari after 21 long years.
And the cars from that era,
Yeah.
they were special too.
Engineering masterpieces. The sources specifically mentioned the F2002 from the 2002 season as just an incredible car. It won 15 out of the 17 races that year. The F2004 was similarly dominant. They were just beautifully engineered, reliable, and incredibly fast machines.
In Schumacher during this period, he didn't just win, he rewrote the record books.
In a way people thought was impossible. The sources detail his incredible run. In 2003, he won his fourth consecutive driver's title, matching the legendary Juan Manuel Fangio's record from the 50s. Then, in 2004, he clinched his seventh overall world championship, 7 titles. At the time, that seemed like a record that would stand forever. And Ferrari, as a team, won 6 straight constructors' titles from 1999 through 2004. Just total dominance.
That level of sustained success must have affected the sport's competitiveness, though.
The sources do acknowledge that. While it was an incredible display of excellence from Ferrari and Schumacher, that sheer dominance did mean that, for a few years, the championship battles weren't always edge-of-your-seat exciting. The standard they set was just so high that other teams struggled to consistently challenge them.
So after years of Ferrari winning everything, did the rule makers try to intervene again? To mix things up?
They did. The sources describe a really rather strange rule change brought in for the 2005 season, specifically aimed at ending the Ferrari dominance and creating more unpredictability. They banned tire changes during the race.
No pit stops for tires at all.
Basically, yes. Unless a tire was obviously punctured or damaged, you had to run the entire race distance, qualifying and the race, on a single set of tires. If you did pit for tires without obvious damage, you face a penalty.
That sounds dangerous. Making tires last hundreds of kilometers under extreme stress.
It was definitely questionable from a safety perspective. The sources call it a remarkably strange rule in hindsight. They give the example of Kimi Räikkönen having a huge suspension failure on the very last lap of the European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring because he'd badly flat-spotted a tire earlier but couldn't change it, and the vibrations just shook the car apart.
Yikes. But did the rule achieve its aim? Did it stop Ferrari?
It actually did, yeah, quite effectively, at least for that year. The sources explain that the Ferrari cars, which used Bridgestone tires, really struggled to make their tires last the required distance under the new rule. Meanwhile, most of their main rivals, like Renault and McLaren, were using Michelin tires, which coped much better with the extreme longevity demands. It completely shuffled the competitive order and ended Ferrari's championship streak.
So the no tire change rule lasted only 1 year.
Thankfully, yes. They reverted back to allowing tire changes for 2006. But after that Ferrari era, the sport entered a period with some really close, exciting championship fights before the next dynasty emerged.
Yeah, the sources mentioned the incredible end to the 2008 season.
Oh, absolutely thrilling. Felipe Massa, driving for Ferrari, crossed the line in the final race in Brazil thinking he'd won the championship. His family, the team, everyone celebrating. Only for Lewis Hamilton in the McLaren to snatch the title literally on the final corner of the final lap by overtaking Timo Glock. Massa was champion for about 30 seconds. It just showed the sport could still deliver unbelievable drama.
Heartbreak and ecstasy in seconds. And then came 2009, and what the sources describe as possibly the greatest story in sporting history, the Braun GP fairy tale.
It's an unbelievable story, isn't it? You couldn't make it up. So Honda, who had poured hundreds of millions into their F1 team, suddenly pulled out at the end of 2008 due to the global financial crisis. Team principal Ross Braun, the same guy who masterminded Ferrari's success, basically led a management buyout, buying the team's assets for a symbolic £1.
£1 for an F1 team.
Essentially, yes. The sources explain he inherited this car that had been designed and developed with Honda's massive budget, but the new Braun GP team had virtually no money to actually run it or develop it further. They didn't even have an engine supplier confirmed until quite late, when Mercedes agreed to provide engines, apparently with a bit of help from McLaren's boss at the time, Martin Whitmarsh.
So a brilliant car design, bought for peanuts, with no money and a last-minute engine deal. How on earth did they become so fast?
The secret weapon, the sources highlight, was a very clever interpretation of the new aerodynamic regulations introduced for 2009. Specifically, a component called the double diffuser. It was a kind of loophole, a design element exploiting the wording of the rules that Braun and a couple of other smaller teams had spotted, but the bigger teams had missed initially.
A loophole gave them a massive advantage.
Huge. Right from the first race, the Braun BGP 001 car was dramatically faster than the rest of the field thanks to this extra downforce from the double diffuser. Jenson Button won 6 of the first 7 races.
An underdog winning thanks to clever engineering.
Exactly. It was the ultimate triumph over adversity story. They were running on fumes financially, barely had enough spare parts, couldn't afford upgrades later in the season. The sources say by the end, the car felt like it was held together by tape and prayers. Red Bull and Sebastian Vettel were catching them fast, but Button and Braun GP just managed to hang on and win both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships. Just incredible.
Truly a fairy tale. And that Braun team, that's the foundation of the Mercedes team we know today.
It is. The sources note that Mercedes-Benz bought the Braun GP team outright at the end of 2009, turning it into their full factory Mercedes F1 team from 2010 onwards. And building on that Braun foundation and investing heavily, Mercedes went on to achieve their own era of unprecedented success later in the decade.
Yeah, winning 8 straight Constructors titles from 2014 to 2021, and Lewis Hamilton taking 6 of his 7 titles with them. An incredible run.
Absolutely dominant.
While Mercedes was building towards that, the 2000s and 2010s also saw F1 really spread its wings globally, didn't it?
Yes, this is a big strategic push for the sport. The sources detail how F1 significantly expanded its footprint beyond its traditional European base. They started adding races in completely new territories, reaching new markets, and adding really diverse flavors to the calendar.
Where did they go? Any standout new races?
Oh yeah. The 2000s saw the first race in the Middle East in Bahrain in 2004. China also joined the calendar in 2004. Then came Singapore in 2008, F1's first ever night race, which was spectacular. Abu Dhabi followed in 2009, another twilight night race. This trend continued, adding races in places like India, South Korea, Russia, Azerbaijan, the US, Austin, Mexico. The calendar became much more global.
Changing the feel of the championship. And alongside going global and pushing technology, the sources mentioned the environment started to become a factor.
Yes, slowly but surely. Environmental considerations began to influence the sport. The sources mentioned the introduction of mandatory sustainable fuel components. Currently, it's a minimum of 10% advanced sustainable ethanol in the fuel blend, with plans to increase that significantly towards 100% sustainable fuels in the future. There are also broader initiatives around recycling, renewable energy use at factories and races, and research into alternative technologies. It's about ensuring F1's long-term relevance and reducing its environmental impact.
That's a big shift. Now, before Mercedes hit their dominant stride with the hybrid engines, Red Bull Racing had their own incredibly successful period in the early 2010s.
They certainly did. Red Bull really emerged as a top team, pushing Braun hard right at the end of 2009, their key weapon. Design genius Adrian Newey. The sources specifically credit Newey's brilliance. He saw the big aerodynamic rule changes for 2009, which were actually intended to reduce downforce, as this golden opportunity to rethink car design fundamentally, wiping the slate clean and potentially overcoming the resource advantages of teams like Ferrari and McLaren.
So the re-changes played into Newey's strengths.
Exactly. He's renowned for his mastery of aerodynamics. The sources list some of his key innovations on the Red Bull cars of that era, like reintroducing pull rod rear suspension, which allows for better airflow at the back, creating aerodynamically shaped suspension wishbones, clever use of the exhaust blowing onto the diffuser, the blown diffuser, the distinctive high rake angle of the car, and that high nose design creating space for airflow underneath.
All adding up to an aerodynamic advantage.
A significant one, yes. The sources explain that the 2010 Red Bull RB6 was just aerodynamically superior, particularly in generating downforce. And they had a young, incredibly fast driver in Sebastian Vettel ready to capitalize. He went on that amazing run, winning 4 consecutive world championships from 2010 through 2013.
That 2010 title fight sounds like it was particularly nail-biting.
It was incredible. The sources note it was the first time ever that four drivers, Vettel, his teammate Mark Webber, Ferrari's Fernando Alonso, and McLaren's Lewis Hamilton, went into the final race of the season still mathematically capable of winning the title. Huge drama in Abu Dhabi. They also briefly mentioned the point system changed in 2010 to the current format we use today, 25 points for a win, etc., which rewards winning more heavily.
Four drivers in the final race.
Right.
And then came 2014 and what the sources call the most significant rule changes in F1 history. The hybrid era began.
This was a seismic shift. Out went the loud, naturally aspirated V8 engines that fans loved, and in came these incredibly complex 1.6-liter turbocharged V6 power units. The key difference was the integration of highly sophisticated hybrid technology, the energy recovery systems, or ERS.
What was the main goal behind such a massive change?
The sources point to several aims. A big one was projecting a cleaner, greener, more technologically advanced image for F1. Another was making the engine technology more directly relevant to the direction of the road car industry, which was moving towards hybridization and downsizing. And crucially, there was a major focus on efficiency. Strict fuel limits were imposed, only 100 kilograms of fuel allowed per race, about 30% less than before, plus limits on the rate of fuel flow into the engine. Things like Red Bull's effective blown diffusers were also banned completely.
How were these new hybrid cars received initially?
Mixed reactions, to say the least. The sources note that the cars in 2014 were initially slower than their V8 predecessors, plagued by reliability issues due to the sheer complexity, and most controversially for many fans, much, much quieter. The high-pitched scream of the V8s was replaced by a lower, more muted turbo V6 sound. Bernie Ecclestone, then F1's boss, was famously critical of the lack of noise.
And who cracked this incredibly complex new power unit formula first?
Mercedes. Absolutely nailed it. The sources are unequivocal. Mercedes had a massive power unit advantage right from the start of the hybrid era in 2014. Neither Red Bull, using Renault engines then, nor Ferrari could get close initially.
A huge horsepower disadvantage for the others, the sources say.
Yes. The gap was significant. The sources even quote Mercedes team boss Toto Wolff admitting years later that they actually had to turn their engine down significantly in 2014. He believed that if they'd showed its true performance potential, the FIA might have stepped in and banned some of their innovative solutions, like their pioneering split turbo design, to level the playing field.
So they sandbagged to avoid being penalized. Clever.
That's the implication. As a result, the sources note the 2014 season became largely an internal battle between the two Mercedes drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, as they often had a performance cushion of a second per lap or more over the rest of the field.
And just bringing us closer to the present, global events have continued to impact the sport.
Yes. The sources briefly mention the significant impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the sport's logistics and finances. One major consequence noted was the sale of the historic Williams team, a name synonymous with F1 since 1977, to American private investors, Doralton Capital, in 2020, largely due to the financial pressures exacerbated by the pandemic. A sad moment for many fans to see the Williams family step away.
A sign of the changing times. And finally, in the last few years, we've seen Red Bull storm back to dominance. How did they overhaul that Mercedes advantage?
Several factors came together. The sources explain Red Bull, with Adrian Newey still weaving his magic, started closing the gap, particularly as Honda developed a very competitive power unit for them. Then came the significant aerodynamic rule changes for 2021, aimed at cutting downforce slightly to manage tire loads. These changes included clipping away part of the floor edge, narrowing rear brake duct winglets, and diffuser fences. Mercedes' clever DAS steering system was also banned.
And these aero changes seem to hurt Mercedes more than Red Bull.
The sources suggest so. They seem to force Mercedes to rethink their aero philosophy in areas where Red Bull, under Newey, perhaps had a stronger fundamental understanding. Then, for the massive regulation change in 2022, bringing back ground effect cars in a new way, Mercedes took a gamble with their radical zero side pod concept. The sources mention they revealed it very late, which hampered their testing and understanding early in the season.
While Red Bull just hit the ground running?
Exactly. The sources note Red Bull's 2022 car, the RB18, was just incredibly well sorted right out of the box under the new rules. Max Verstappen was able to utterly dominate the 2022 season, winning the title by a record margin of 146 points, even though Ferrari looked very competitive early on before faltering with reliability and strategy issues.
And 2023 was even more dominant for Red Bull.
Record-breakingly so. The sources highlight their incredible 2023 season, winning 21 out of the 22 races, just staggering consistency and speed. The sources describe Max Verstappen's current dominance as calm, confident, almost serene, setting a new benchmark for relentless high performance.
Wow, what an incredible journey through the decades. We've covered so much history, the evolution of the cars, the teams, the rules. Now let's really dive under the skin of a modern F1 car. Let's talk about the science and tech that makes them the fastest racing cars on the planet, drawing on what the sources tell us.
Right, this is where things get really fascinating, and you see how all that history and learning culminates. First off, the sources make a key point. We don't just call it an engine anymore, it's a power unit.
Because it's much more than just the petrol engine part.
Exactly. It's this incredibly complex hybrid system. At its heart, yes, there's an internal combustion engine, specifically a 1.6-liter V6 engine with a single turbocharger. But it's intricately combined with powerful electric motors and the energy recovery system, the ERS.
And what kind of performance does this whole power unit deliver?
We're talking serious numbers. The sources state the combined output, petrol and electric, is around 1,000 brake horsepower. The V6 engine itself revs incredibly high, up to 15,000 RPM. This gives them insane acceleration, 0 to 60 miles per hour in roughly 2.6 seconds. Top speeds depend on the track setup, but they can exceed 230 miles per hour.
And the fuel itself is changing, becoming more sustainable.
Yes, that's a key direction. The sources mention the fuel now has to be similar in composition to regular road petrol, complying with EU standards, and importantly, it must currently contain at least 10% advanced sustainable ethanol. The plan is to move towards 100% sustainable fuels. Despite the efficiency gains, they still carry a fair bit of fuel, around 135 liters usually, which is about 110 kilograms, the maximum allowed for the race.
Okay, let's break down that ERS, the energy recovery system. How does that actually capture and redeploy energy?
The sources explain it has two main parts, often called MGUs, motor generator units. There's the MGUK and the MGUH.
Okay, MGUK. The K is for kinetic.
You got it. The MGUK is connected essentially to the engine's crankshaft. When the driver brakes, instead of all that energy being lost as heat through the brakes, the MGUK acts like a generator, harvesting that kinetic energy and storing it as electricity in a battery.
And then it can give that energy back.
Yes, when the driver wants a boost, the MGUK reverses its role and acts as an electric motor, sending extra power up to about 160 bhp, which is significant back to the crankshaft, boosting acceleration. There are rules about how much energy can be deployed per lap and when it can be used at full power, like not below 100 kilometers at the start.
Okay, that's kinetic energy recovery. What about the MGUH for heat?
Exactly. The MGUH is connected to the turbocharger. Turbos spin incredibly fast, driven by hot exhaust gases. The MGUH can harvest electrical energy from the excess heat and rotational energy in the turbo system, especially when the driver lifts off the throttle and the turbo might otherwise spin down.
And it can also help the turbo.
Yes, this is crucial. It can act as a motor, too, using electrical energy to spin the turbo up before the driver hits the throttle or when exhaust flow is low. This drastically reduces turbo lag, making the power delivery much more immediate. And here's the really clever bit the sources point out. Energy harvested by the MGUH doesn't have to go to the battery. It can be sent directly to the MGUK.
Bypassing the battery limit.
Effectively, yes. It allows the electric boost from the MGUK to be sustained for longer periods each lap than the battery deployment limit alone would allow. It's a complex energy flow management system.
So it's not just raw power, it's about managing this energy flow super intelligently.
Precisely. The sources emphasize this. Power management is incredibly sophisticated. Drivers select different engine modes or ERS deployment maps from their steering wheel. These maps, developed by engineers, dictate how and where the harvested electrical energy is deployed during a lap, maybe a big boost down the main straight, or smaller boosts out of several corners.
And with all this high-voltage electricity flying around, safety must be paramount.
Hugely important. The sources mention multiple safety systems. There are indicator lights on top of the car's airbox. Green means the ERS system is safe. Red means it's potentially live, high voltage, and dangerous to touch. They give the example of Daniel Ricciardo being warned over the radio not to touch his car after it stopped with a red light showing in Bahrain 2019.
Good warning. Anything else?
Yeah, the cars need external starters to fire up the petrol engine. They can't just turn a key. There are also sophisticated anti-stall systems to help prevent the engine cutting out if the driver spins. And the FIA mandates lots of standardized sensors, things that measure electrical current, torque, fuel flow, pressures, temperatures, all from approved suppliers to ensure they can monitor everything and check teams are playing by the complex rules.
Okay, that's the power unit. Now, how did they get all that power onto the track and make the cars corner like they're on rails? Aerodynamics. The
Yep.
sources call it the core science of F1.
It absolutely is. The sources really stress this. Modern F1 is dominated by aerodynamics. It's all about manipulating the airflow around the car to achieve two main things: minimize aerodynamic drag, which resists forward motion, and maximize downforce.
Downforce being the opposite of lift on an airplane wing.
Exactly. F1 cars use inverted wing profiles and carefully shaped bodywork to create low pressure underneath the car and high pressure on top. This difference in pressure generates a powerful suction force, downforce, that pushes the car down onto the track surface.
And more downforce equals more grip.
Massively more grip. The sources explain that downforce increases the load on the tires, effectively squashing them into the track. This allows the cars to corner at speeds that would be physically impossible otherwise. It also helps with braking and acceleration grip, and can even help manage tire wear by maintaining a consistent contact patch. The big challenge is balancing downforce with drag. More downforce usually means more drag, which slows you down on the straights. Getting that trade-off right for each specific circuit is key.
So where does a modern F1 car actually generate all this downforce?
It's a combination of several key components working together. The sources detail them. First up, the front wing. It's incredibly complex now. It doesn't just generate downforce itself. Its main job is to precisely manage the airflow for the rest of the car. It directs air around the front wheels, which create a lot of drag and turbulence, and shapes the air into controlled swirling patterns called vortices.
Vortices, like mini tornadoes. Why do they want those?
Controlled ones, yes. The sources explain these carefully generated vortices are used further back along the car, particularly to help seal the edges of the floor, enhancing the ground effect generated by the car's underbody. Then you have the barge boards and side pod vanes, those complex arrays of fins and turning vanes you see behind the front wheels. Their job is to clean up the turbulent air coming off the front wheels and wing, and direct smooth airflow towards the rear, and importantly, underneath the car.
And the floor itself is now a massive downforce generator, right? Under the current rules.
Hugely important. The regulations brought back shaped underbodies or ground effect tunnels in 2022. The carefully sculpted shape of the floor tunnels, combined with the car often running with a rake angle, tilted slightly forward, creates a powerful low-pressure area underneath, sucking the car down. Then at the very back, you have the diffuser.
The diffuser, that upward sweeping section at the rear.
That's the one. It's crucial. It helps accelerate the air coming out from underneath the car, further enhancing the low pressure under the floor and generating a huge chunk of the car's total downforce. The sources suggest the diffuser and underfloor combined can account for more than half of the car's total downforce.
Wow. And the rear wing on top is still important too.
Oh, yes. The rear wing provides significant, relatively clean downforce. Its angle can be adjusted quite easily, making it a key tool for tuning the car's balance for different tracks. More angle for slow, twisty tracks like Monaco, less angle for high-speed tracks like Monza to reduce drag. The end plates on the rear wing also help manage airflow and shape vortices.
And one very visible part of the rear wing is the DRS flap. Remind us how that works.
DRS, the drag reduction system. Introduced back in 2011, the sources explain, to help make overtaking easier, as the complex aerodynamics made it hard for cars to follow each other closely due to the turbulent, dirty air wake.
So how does it give a speed boost?
It's a movable flap, the upper element of the rear wing. When the driver activates DRS, this flap opens up flat. This drastically reduces the aerodynamic drag generated by the rear wing, allowing the car to achieve a higher top speed on the straights, maybe 10-15 km faster.
But drivers can't just use it whenever they want.
No, there are strict rules. The sources explain it can only be activated in specific designated DRS zones on the track, usually long straights following slower corners. And crucially, the pursuing driver must be within 1 second of the car ahead at a specific detection point just before the zone. If they meet that condition, a light comes on in their cockpit, and they can press the DRS button on their steering wheel to open the flap. It adds a real tactical element to racing.
And the future direction for aero rules is trying to reduce that dirty air problem.
Yes, that's a major focus. The sources note that the 2022 regulations and likely future tweaks are specifically aimed at changing the way the cars manage their aerodynamic wake, trying to create less turbulent air behind them. The goal is to allow cars to follow each other more closely through corners without losing as much downforce, which should hopefully lead to closer racing and more natural overtaking opportunities, perhaps reducing the reliance on DRS.
How do teams actually develop and test these incredibly complicated aerodynamic surfaces? It must be hugely expensive.
It is. The sources highlight the two primary tools they use, the traditional wind tunnel and the increasingly powerful computer simulation method, CFD, computational fluid dynamics.
The wind tunnels have been around for ages, right?
They have, but they're incredibly sophisticated now. The sources describe the wind tunnel as more of a validation tool these days. Teams build highly detailed scale models of their cars. Regulations limit them to 60% scale currently, and also limit the maximum wind speed they can use. They place this model in the tunnel, blow air over it, and use incredibly sensitive sensors to measure the forces, downforce, drag, and visualize the airflow patterns using techniques like laser sheets and smoke.
But wind tunnel testing is restricted now.
Yes, heavily. The FIA limits the amount of wind tunnel testing time teams are allowed, using a sliding scale based on their championship position. Teams lower down get more time, top teams get less. It's an attempt to level the playing field and control costs.
And CFD is the virtual wind tunnel.
Pretty much. CFD is incredibly powerful. The sources explain it uses massive computing power to simulate the airflow around a virtual model of the car. The computer divides the airspace into millions, sometimes billions, of tiny cells and solves complex mathematical equations, Navier-Stokes equations essentially, to predict how the air will behave.
What are the advantages of CFD?
It allows engineers to test countless design iterations very quickly and relatively cheaply compared to building physical parts for the wind tunnel. They can visualize airflow in incredible detail, understand exactly why a design works or doesn't work, and refine concepts virtually before committing to physical testing. The sources say it's vital for modern F1 design.
Are there restrictions on CFD use too?
Yes, similar to wind tunnels, the FIA restricts the amount of CFD processing power teams can use, again on a sliding scale based on championship position. However, the sources note a potential loophole. There aren't strict limits on the efficiency of the software or the raw power of the computers teams use, so wealthier teams can potentially still gain an advantage by investing more in supercomputers and software development.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so we have the power unit, the aero. The only thing actually touching the track is the tires. The sources stress just how critical these are.
Absolutely fundamental. They are the only connection between the car and the road. All those hundreds of horsepower, all that mega downforce, it all has to go through 4 patches of rubber, roughly the size of a piece of paper each. Their performance is everything.
And Pirelli is the sole supplier now, providing the same tires to all teams.
That's right. Pirelli has been the exclusive tire supplier since 2011. This was brought in partly to control costs and also to try and ensure closer competition, removing tire wars between different manufacturers as a variable. Though, as the sources mention, there have been periods in the past with multiple suppliers, like the Bridgestone versus Michelin battles in the 2000s, which sometimes led to controversy, like that infamous 2005 U.S. Grand Prix where all the Michelin runners withdrew on safety grounds, leaving only 6 cars to race.
So what different types of tires does Pirelli provide?
For dry conditions, the sources explain they have a range of 5 slick tire compounds, designated C1 to C5. C1 is the hardest, most durable compound, and C5 is the softest, fastest, but least durable compound. They also provide 2 types of tires for wet weather. The intermediate tire, marked with green sidewalls, for damp tracks or light rain, and the full wet tire, blue sidewalls, for heavy rain and standing water.
And those colored sidewalls we see on the slick tires during a race weekend, red, yellow, white, how do they relate to the C1, C5 range?
This is a key point the sources clarify. For each Grand Prix, Pirelli assesses the track, how abrasive the surface is, the cornering loads, expected temperatures, and selects 3 specific compounds from that C1, C5 range to bring to the event. It's always 3 consecutive compounds for each C2, C3, C4. The softest of those 3 nominated compounds for that specific weekend is designated the soft and marked with a red sidewall. The middle compound is the medium, yellow sidewall, and the hardest of the 3 is the hard, white sidewall.
Ah, okay. So the color is relative to the weekend selection, not fixed to the C number. A C3 could be white one week and yellow the next.
Exactly. It depends which 3 compounds Pirelli brings. For example, at a high abrasion track, they might bring C1, hard white, C2, medium yellow, and C3, soft red. But At a low abrasion street circuit, they might bring C3 hard white, C4 medium yellow, and C5 soft red. So you always know red is the softest option available that weekend, yellow the middle, white the hardest.
Got it. What's the fundamental challenge teams face with tire performance?
It's always a trade-off, a balancing act between pure speed, grip, and durability, how long the tire lasts before its performance drops off significantly, known as degradation or degree. The sources explain the basic principle. Softer compounds offer more grip, allowing faster lap times, but they wear out much quicker. Harder compounds are slower initially, but last much longer.
And managing that wear is crucial.
Absolutely. If tires wear out too quickly, performance plummets, drivers might struggle with grip, and there's an increased risk of sudden failure or blowout. It also forces teams into making more pit stops to change tires, and each pit stop costs significant time, typically 20-25 seconds.
Yeah.
So finding the right tire strategy, which compounds to use and when to pit, is a massive part of winning races.
Do teams get an unlimited supply of tires for the weekend?
No, they get a specific allocation. Pirelli provides each driver with a set number of sets of each of the 3 nominated slick compounds for the weekend, plus sets of intermediates and wets. They have to manage this allocation through practice, qualifying, and the race. And race rules mandate that, in a dry race, each driver must use at least 2 different slick compounds. This forces at least 1 pit stop.
And there's that strategic wrinkle linked to qualifying performance, the Q3 tire rule.
Yes, a very important one the sources highlight. The drivers who make it into the final part of qualifying, Q3, the top 10 shootout for pole position, are required to start the race on the exact set of tires they used to set their fastest lap time in the preceding Q2 session.
So the top 10 are locked into their starting tire compound from Q2.
Correct. But drivers who qualify in 11th place or lower get a free choice of which slick compound they want to start the race on. This can be a significant strategic advantage, allowing them to potentially start on a harder, more durable tire and run a longer first stint, or gamble on a softer tire for early track position, giving them more flexibility than the top 10 qualifiers.
That adds another layer to qualifying strategy. How do teams and drivers actually manage the tires during the weekend?
It's a hugely complex process. Teams use vast amounts of data collected during practice sessions, measuring tire temperatures, wear rates, degradation combined with track temperature forecasts, air temperature, race distance, and historical data to model different strategy options. The driver plays a key role too, managing the tires through their driving style, being smooth or aggressive, the lines they take through corners, adjusting settings like brake bias and differential settings from the cockpit to influence tire temperature and wear. The circuit layout itself also heavily influences strategy. A track where overtaking is easy might favor more pit stops, while a track like Monaco, where track position is everything, might encourage trying a one-stop strategy if possible. Safety car probability is also factored in.
So much goes into just the tires.
Okay.
Let's move on to the car's core structure and other key systems. The sources talk about the monocoque as being central.
It is, literally and figuratively. The monocoque is the main structural element of the car. The sources describe it as this incredibly strong, lightweight shell, usually made from carbon fiber composite materials, that forms the central tub where the driver sits.
And it's the main safety feature, the survival cell.
Exactly. It's designed to be incredibly resistant to impact and penetration. All the other major components, the engine, gearbox, suspension, wings, attached to this central monocoque. Its immense strength provides the primary protection for the driver in a crash, forming a protective cocoon. Knowing they're surrounded by this incredibly strong structure gives drivers the confidence to push the limits.
What about the suspension? How does that work in an F1 car? It looks complicated.
It is very sophisticated, designed for maximum aerodynamic efficiency and precise control. The sources explain the typical layout uses double wishbones, those A-shaped arms, connecting the wheel hub to the chassis. But instead of springs and dampers directly attached to the wishbones like on many road cars, F1 cars typically use push rods or pull rods.
Push rods and pull rods.
Yeah, these are rods that transfer the suspension loads inwards, operating rockers which then act on inboard mounted springs, often compact torsion bars rather than coil springs, and dampers. This keeps the bulky suspension components out of the airflow and allows for more precise control. The sources also mention a heave spring or damper element that controls the vertical movement of the whole chassis, crucial for maintaining a stable aerodynamic platform. It's all made from lightweight materials like carbon fiber and packaged very tightly within the bodywork. And critically, mandatory wheel tethers, strong cables are attached to prevent wheels flying off in an accident.
The brakes must be incredibly powerful, too, to stop from those speeds.
Absolutely immense stopping power. The sources describe the system as hydraulic, with separate master cylinders for the front and rear brakes. A key tool for the driver is the brake bias adjustment, a dial on the steering wheel that allows them to shift the braking force distribution between the front and rear wheels, sometimes corner by corner, to optimize braking performance and stability.
And they glow red hot, right? Managing heat must be crucial.
Yes, managing the extreme heat is vital. They use carbon brake discs and pads, which work effectively at incredibly high temperatures, upwards of 1,000 degrees Celsius. The discs are drilled with thousands of tiny cooling holes, and large carbon fiber ducts funnel cooling air onto the brakes. Interestingly, the sources note the rear brakes are often smaller than the fronts, partly because the MGUK's regenerative braking function provides a significant amount of the stopping force at the rear axle. And the wheels themselves are held on by a single central wheel nut for super fast pit stops, with retention mechanisms to prevent them coming off accidentally.
And with the engine, turbo, and ERS all generating massive heat, cooling systems must be extensive.
Hugely important for performance and reliability. The sources detail a complex network of radiators, mostly housed within the distinctive side pods of the car, but also elsewhere. There are separate cooling circuits for engine coolant, engine oil, gearbox oil, hydraulic fluid, the ERS battery, the MGUK, the MGUH, and the charge air coming from the turbo, the intercooler. Keeping everything within its optimal temperature range is critical.
What about the fuel tank? Is that just a metal can?
Oh no, far from it. For safety, F1 cars use a highly specialized fuel cell. The sources describe it as a flexible, puncture-resistant bladder made from military-grade materials like Kevlar, reinforced with rubber. It's designed to deform in a crash rather than rupture, minimizing the risk of fire. It sits within a protected compartment in the monocoque, usually behind the driver, and low down. It holds just enough fuel for the race distance, typically 110 kilograms or around 150 liters, as mid-race refueling is banned. Internal baffles stop the fuel sloshing around violently under the extreme G-forces, which helps maintain consistent weight distribution and prevents fuel starvation in corners.
And the gearbox, still manually shifted.
Not manually, no. The sources mention they use highly advanced 8-speed semi-automatic sequential gearboxes. Drivers shift gears up and down using paddles on the steering wheel. The gearbox itself is usually a structural component at the rear of the car, attaching the engine to the rear suspension and crash structure. It connects to the rear wheels via drive shafts with special tripod joints that allow for the suspension movement. They have 7 forward gears and 1 reverse gear, mandated by the rules.
We've talked about the monocoque as the survival cell. What other structures protect the driver in a crash?
In addition to the super strong monocoque, the sources mention specific deformable crash structures designed to absorb impact energy. There's a front structure, which includes the removable nosecone assembly. There are side impact structures concealed within the 5 pods. And there's a rear impact structure integrated with the gearbox casing. These work together with the monocoque to dissipate crash forces away from the driver.
And then there's the protection above the driver's head, the roll hoop, and the halo.
Yes, crucial safety elements. The main roll hoop is the structure integrated into the chassis just behind the driver's head, designed to protect them in a rollover accident. And then, introduced in 2018 amidst some initial controversy about aesthetics, is the halo device. The sources reiterate its vital importance. It's that wishbone-shaped structure made of incredibly strong titanium encased in carbon fiber mounted above the cockpit opening.
And its job is purely head protection.
Exactly. It's designed to deflect large pieces of debris or even other cars away from the driver's head. The sources highlight its immense strength. It can withstand forces equivalent to the weight of a double-decker bus, over 12,000 kilograms or 26,455 pounds. It has already been credited with preventing serious injuries or worse in several major accidents since its introduction, a huge step forward in safety.
Absolutely. Okay, let's step inside the cockpit now. What's it like for the driver in there? And tell us about that incredibly complex steering wheel.
It's a very tight, very specialized environment. The sources describe the driver sitting in a custom-molded carbon fiber seat made precisely to their body shape in a highly reclined position, almost lying down to keep the center of gravity low and for aerodynamic reasons. They're held in place by a 6-point racing harness, strapping them tightly into the seat.
And they wear the harness device.
Yes, the hands device head and neck support. It's mandatory. It's a carbon fiber collar that sits on the driver's shoulders and is connected by tethers to their helmet. It's held in place by the shoulder straps of the harness. Its crucial job is to limit the extreme forward movement of the head and neck during heavy braking or, more importantly, in a frontal impact, significantly reducing the risk of severe neck or skull base injuries.
What else is in the cockpit?
There's usually a drink system with a tube feeding fluid to the driver, essential in hot races. The helmet itself is a marvel of engineering, with aerodynamic spoilers, fire-resistant materials, and a very narrow visor opening for protection. And the cockpit is so snug that the steering wheel has to be removed for the driver to get in and out.
And that steering wheel, it looks like a video game controller on steroids.
It really does. The sources describe it as definitely not round, more rectangular or butterfly-shaped, and absolutely covered in buttons, dials, and switches, plus a large LCD screen in the center. This screen displays crucial information: current gear, engine RPM, lap times, delta times to rivals or target laps, ERS charge levels, tire temperatures, warning lights. It's customizable by the driver and team.
And all those buttons and dials. What can the driver actually control from the wheel while racing at 200 mph?
An astonishing amount. The sources list a whole range of functions. They can adjust brake bias, shifting brake pressure front to rear. They change engine modes affecting power delivery and fuel consumption. They manage ERS deployment strategies, how and where the electric boost is used. They activate DRS. They fine-tune the differential settings, which affects car rotation and traction. They can select preset modes for wet conditions or tire saving. There's the pit lane speed limiter button, the radio button to talk to the team, often an overtake button for a temporary maximum power boost.
Plus the gear shift paddles.
Yes, paddles on the back for upshifts and downshifts, and usually clutch paddles used only for the start procedure. It's an incredibly complex interface, requiring immense concentration and dexterity from the drivers while they're dealing with huge G-forces.
And underlying all this complex machinery is a massive network of sensors gathering data.
A truly vast network. The sources emphasize that hundreds of sensors are embedded throughout the car, monitoring virtually everything. They collect thousands of data points every single second. Each car generates something like 40 megabytes of data over the course of a single race.
What sort of things are they measuring?
Everything imaginable. Temperatures, engine, tires, brakes, ERS, pressures, oil, fuel, hydraulics, tires, speeds, wheel speeds, car speed, suspension loads and movements, G-forces, driver inputs, steering angle, throttle position, brake pressure, GPS position, ERS status. The sources mention specific examples like the pitot tube mounted at the front to measure airspeed, crucial for aerodynamics, accelerometers worn in the driver's earplugs to measure head forces in an impact, even microphones listening to the engine and exhaust note for diagnostic purposes.
Which leads us perfectly into the next big topic.
Yeah.
The absolutely crucial role of data in modern F1. The sources call it the new fuel.
It's become completely fundamental. The sources explain how data analysis, increasingly powered by artificial intelligence, AI, is just revolutionizing every aspect of the sport car design, race strategy, performance optimization, even the fan experience. They quote Red Bull's boss, Christian Horner, explicitly stating that data is the vital essence of their entire operation. It drives everything: understanding performance, refining strategy, developing the car, analyzing driver performance, everything.
And processing the sheer volume of data requires serious computing power.
Oh, absolutely. High-performance computing, HPC, is essential. The sources note F1 teams are constantly pushing the boundaries of computing power in their relentless search for tiny competitive advantages hidden within the data.
How has the way teams handle data evolved?
Massively. The sources paint a picture of going from relatively simple manual systems decades ago to today's incredibly sophisticated interconnected networks. You've got those hundreds of sensors on each car generating that 40 millibeat of data per race, plus external telemetry constantly streaming back to the pits and the team's factory.
And the teams get this data instantly during the race.
In real time, yes. The sources emphasize this. Using high-speed wireless networks 5G, satellite links teams receive around 10,000 data points per second from each car. This allows engineers on the pit wall and, crucially, hundreds more back at the team's mission control center at the factory to monitor every aspect of the car's performance live.
What can they do with that real-time data?
They can monitor engine health, check suspension loads, track tire pressures and temperatures, predict tire degradation, tune car settings remotely, within the rules, run simulations to predict race outcomes based on different strategy choices, and even provide direct coaching or instructions to the driver based on what the data is showing compared to rivals or optimal performance.
And data isn't just about going faster. It's also vital for improving safety.
A really critical point the sources make. They use the powerful example of Romain Grosjean's horrific fiery crash in Bahrain in 2020. The analysis of the data recorders from his car, including the high-G accelerometer in his earpiece, provided immediate, invaluable insights into the crash dynamics and how the safety systems performed. This data was used almost instantly to refine future safety protocols, car construction standards, and circuit safety features, demonstrating this commitment to continuous learning and improvement driven by data.
And data even plays a role in identifying and developing driving talent now.
Yes, increasingly so. The sources use Max Verstappen's career path as an example. He was signed to the Red Bull program and entered F1 at the incredibly young age of 17. But the sources note he'd already spent 3 years, from the age of 14, intensively honing his skills in Red Bull's sophisticated driving simulator. This data-rich virtual training environment allowed him to gain experience and allowed the team to analyze his development in immense detail, mitigating some of the risks associated with his youth and relative lack of real-world track time before F1. The sources also make the important point that a driver's victory is always the result of a massive team effort, including the hundreds, sometimes over 1,500 people at a team like Red Bull, analyzing data and making decisions back at base and on the pit wall.
It really is woven into the fabric of the sport now. Okay, let's bring it back to safety for a moment. We've touched on it throughout, but let's just briefly recap that incredible evolution from those terrifying early days to the sophisticated protection drivers have today.
It's a journey marked by tragedy, sadly, but also incredible progress. The sources remind us of just how lethal F1 was in the 50s and 60s, the lack of basic gear, the appalling fatality rates, and those terrible wake-up calls like the Von Trips disaster in 61 and especially the dark weekend at Imola in 94, which forced major change.
And the cornerstone of modern driver safety is that carbon fiber monocoque.
Absolutely. The sources describe it as the primary safety structure, that incredible strong survival cell or tub that surrounds the driver. It's designed to remain largely intact even in massive impacts, shielding the driver from external forces and intrusion.
And the halo, added more recently, provides that crucial overhead protection.
Unquestionably vital now. The sources reiterate the halo, introduced in 2018, is made from that super strong titanium wrapped in carbon fiber. Its sole purpose is protecting the driver's head from large debris or impacts with other cars or barriers, addressing a vulnerability highlighted by tragic accidents in the past. Its immense strength, remember it can support the weight of a bus, has already proven its worth many times over.
What other key safety structures work alongside the monocoque and halo?
The sources mentioned those deformable crash structures we talked about, the nose cone at the front, side impact structures within the side pods, and the rear impact structure integrated with the gearbox. These are all designed to crumple in a controlled way, absorbing impact energy before it reaches the driver in the survival cell.
And fire safety has improved dramatically, too.
Hugely. The sources discuss measures like those flexible, puncture-resistant fuel tanks made from materials like Kevlar, designed to contain fuel even in major accidents and resist ignition from heat. Combined with fire-retardant overalls, gloves, boots, and helmet systems, the risk of serious injury from fire, while never zero, is massively reduced compared to the past.
Plus other gear like the wheel tethers enhance the device.
Yes, all part of the layered safety approach. The wheel tethers stop wheels flying off and becoming dangerous projectiles in accidents. The harness device protects the head and neck. Even helmet design continues to evolve, with specific shapes for aerodynamics and safety and those narrow visor openings.
It's clear that the drive for safety, often spurred by tragedy, has been relentless and continues today.
It absolutely does. The sources emphasize that F1 is constantly analyzing incidents, gathering data, and researching new materials and structures to make the sport safer. That core focus on managing speeds, particularly cornering speeds, which really intensified after Imola 94, remains a fundamental consideration in every set of technical regulations. Safety is never solved. It's an ongoing process.
Okay, so we've taken this incredible deep dive through the entire world of Formula One. We've traced its history from those incredibly dangerous, almost amateur beginnings, through all the technical revolutions, mid-engines, ground effect, turbos, hybrids. We've looked at the dominant dynasties, the mind-bending science and engineering inside the modern car, broken down what actually happens on a race weekend, seen the vital role data now plays, and charted the crucial evolution of safety.
It's just such a multi-layered sport, isn't it? It constantly pushes the boundaries of technology, human skill, strategy, and it's wrapped in this incredible history and drama.
And we really, really hope that going through all this, exploring the sources you shared with us, has given you, our listener, a much richer understanding, a deeper appreciation for everything that goes into making F1 what it is. Our goal was really to give you that insider's track, make you feel more informed, more connected the next time you watch a race and the lights go out.
Yeah, hopefully you've got some new perspectives now. Maybe you'll spot things on the cars you didn't notice before, or understand the strategies playing out in a new way, or just marvel even more at what these drivers and the thousands of people behind them achieve every single race weekend.
So to leave you with something to chew on, a final thought inspired by everything we've discussed today. When you think about that constant tension throughout F1 history, the relentless push for more speed versus the hard-won vital improvements in safety, and you add in the sport's newer focus on sustainability, plus the ongoing challenge of keeping the competition close. What do you think the ultimate Formula One car of the future might actually look like? And how will all those powerful, sometimes competing forces shape its design and performance?
That's the big question, isn't it? And finding the answer will keep engineers busy for years to come.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into Formula One.